Welcome to Stories of Hope, brought to you by the Neurocritical Care Society, designed to uplift and inspire patients, their families and caregivers, and the healthcare providers who treat them. Stories of Hope feature patient-oriented stories, sharing experiences of those who have experienced neurological trauma or injury and have incredible stories to tell about their recovery. This episode is brought to you by the Curing Coma campaign, a campaign of the Neurocritical Care Society focused on awakening hope and finding a way to stop and cure instances of coma.
On today's episode, we have two inspiring patient stories. First is Janet's story. Janet suffered a brain aneurysm on March 22, 2004, while walking her dog. She tells her story of recovery and her experience in the neuro ICU.
Hi, I'm Janet Sutherland. I am a brain aneurysm survivor. I suffered a ruptured brain aneurysm on March 22nd, 2004. I was walking my dog and had the worst headache on the planet. At least that's what I told the 911 operator. I suffered this horrible headache. I guess I called it the worst headache on the planet. And the operator, the paramedics took me to the hospital, and the doctor told my parents that I had 3% chance of living. So I ended up just being in a coma. From the moment they took me to the hospital, I was unconscious, and I was continually in a coma from that moment on. I never saw my family or friends. I was completely unconscious for 3 weeks. It was interesting because I never saw a person, but I did hear people. I heard someone saying, everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be okay. It was my father who was saying, everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be okay. He repeatedly said that to me. And my father actually sat at my bedside and he would read my favorite children's books, which was Babar and Curious George. Apparently, someone told him to do that. I guess that was to calm me down and keep me from being anxious. But he kept saying everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be okay. The interesting thing about that was that I remember it. I remember my comas, and I remember battling fights and that kind of a thing. But something triggered me from being calm and knowing I was going to be okay. And I often wonder if what my father was telling me, everything's going to be all right, everything is going to be okay, calmed me and helped me fight the fight and fight for my life. I don't know. That's just my theory. But my message there is that we can hear you when we're unconscious. I'll tell you what, my mom kept saying, she looks kind of fat, she looks kind of puffy, so be careful what you say when we're unconscious, because I think it's more effective when you're positive and you're uplifting when we're unconscious. That would help because I was fighting for my life a lot. And if it weren't for my father saying everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be all right, that really helped a lot in reading my favorite children's books. That really helped. And I do remember those she looks fat comments afterwards. I did kind of remind my mom after I woke up those comments too. So we do hear you, and I would encourage people who are with their loved ones that are unconscious to keep it positive and keep it uplifting and encourage people when they're fighting their battle of their life. That's very important when you're unconscious. That's one message that I would say. But also, someone told my parents to start moving my arms and my legs. I don't know who it was, but they started moving my left arm and my left leg. And I think that was sort of a way to build up the brain path. So, because I had such a massive bleed, I'm wondering if that was something that a doctor or a nurse or a physical therapist told my parents, but they continue to do that. They continue to move my left arm and left leg the entire time I was unconscious. But I can tell you that when I was in physical therapy, it was a lot easier to start working my left arm. So I would say that that was helpful. Starting to build the brain path was very important. And repeating any kind of movement on the weak side was super helpful. So that was another thing. So number one, when you're unconscious and you're in a coma, send positive messages and make sure that you continue to say everything's going to be okay. And remember that people can't hear you. So be positive there. So when you get into physical therapy, I would encourage you to listen to your physical therapist, and I would encourage medical professionals to make sure you educate the family members and friends or anyone around them so that they can learn all about building the brain path. Now, when I'm sure the medical professionals will explain the brain path, I had a massive bleed and my brain path on my left side was wiped out during the bleed. So it had to be built back, and I had to retrain my brain and my movement on my left arm and my left leg and my stomach muscles. My arm would fall out of my bed, and my leg would fall out of my bed. And so I had to kind of repeat and do everything and make sure that my arm would move regularly. And my mom would make me use the salt shaker and continue to use the salt shaker and also use my arm out of the dryer. And I would do that as well. So, and that would also strengthen my core muscles. So it wasn't until my father started working my leg that I was using a walker that I continued to work my walker. And when I was working my walker one day, and I noticed that my left leg started to work on its own after working my leg. So we took the walker away and started to build a brain pattern on our own. So at that point, we decided, let's try and see if I can walk on my own. We've been building the brain pattern, repeating, and I ended up putting my walker away and using my cane. So educating the family, repeating the motions, and making sure that you talk positively to people in the coma. Those are the messages that I would like to send to everyone, and don't lose hope. All this information can be available too in a book that I wrote called Nose Over Toes. My dad kept a great journal, and it teaches the lessons of how to recover from a brain aneurysm. So that's my story, and I wish everyone luck, and you will survive. And these are just little tidbits on how to survive a coma and recover through rehabilitation. Thank you.
Next, Chris shares the story of when he was performing in a church in London more than 45 years ago and caught meningococcal meningitis, which led to a hospitalization for coma and a near-death experience.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for letting me share my experiences with you in World Coma Day. I happen to be sitting here in beautiful rural Shropshire, only about 15 kilometres from the house where Charles Darwin was born and where he went to school. Anyway, the story happened a long time ago, 47 years ago, when I was a 20-year-old undergraduate medical student in London and a keen amateur musician, as I still am. I had been performing in Benjamin Britten's St. Nicholas Mass in a church in London, and I caught meningococcal meningitis from a flute player sitting in front of me, who was a nasal carrier. Everybody in the choir and audience was later swabbed by public health and discovered several nasal carriers in the vicinity, but I was the only person who got ill. I went to bed early that evening feeling unwell with a feverish flu-like illness and some vomiting and diarrhea. I was discovered unconscious probably about midnight by friends who were concerned about me and called in because they hadn't seen me. I remember nothing of this period except some bright lights, unpleasant motion, some pain, faces, and loud noises. The next thing I remember is floating in a mist, calm, tranquil. Myself, I was aware that it was me. I wasn't sure where I was or what was happening. There was some sense of the passage of time. And I started to hear the most beautiful, entrancing music, somewhat in the style of Bach, choral music, sacred music, but utterly beautiful, like the music of the spheres. I have no idea for how long this persisted. but it was comfortable and benign, and I was happy to go along with it. At times, the music got louder and the mist seemed to be brighter, and I sensed I was approaching some sort of threshold where maybe a decision was needed. I was tempted to give up, let myself sink into this, sort of abandon myself and float off into the mist to wherever it went. But something pulled me back. I was young, very inexperienced. My whole life was before me. I had done or achieved nothing, and I made a conscious decision that I was going to choose life and return from wherever this was. I have no idea. I have no idea how long I persisted drifting along in this state. Apart from the music, I was totally alone. There were no images of any kind. I was unaware of my body. I felt no pain. I saw no beings, entities, heard no voices, had no perception of the doctors and nurses who must have been treating me. And my only recollection is of feeling tired, as if perhaps I'd had enough of this. But I could have easily relaxed into a peaceful death, I think, and let myself slip away. But some part of me felt I was being presented with an opportunity to come back and lead a life, although I'm not sure I was aware how ill I was, and I had no idea what had happened to me. Although I was hearing almost endless choral music, strangely, I cannot recall hearing any proper words or understanding any text or meaning to what the choral music conveyed. I have no idea how much time I spent in this state, but sometime 24 hours or so later, I surfaced into a state of what I can only describe as altered consciousness. I awoke in a darkened room with a nurse in attendance, feeling pretty dreadful then, but still not scared or frightened. I started having very vivid and prolonged, rather cheerful, euphoric hallucinations. The typical hospital pictures on the walls that are provided by volunteers and the Red Cross came to life. The figures in them emerged from the frame as fully formed shapes, came out, sat on the side of the bed and were surrounding me, talking to me, telling jokes, laughing, and sort of interfering with what was going on. So I found it very hard to listen to the nurses or doctors that attended, pay any attention to them, because I was being distracted by the interruptions of these clownish figures leaping around my bed. In one of the figures, there were donkeys and animals. They came to life as well and were in the room with me. So it was quite a cheerful menagerie sitting there. That lasted for a couple of days, I think, until eventually 6 days later, I was deemed well enough to leave the sort of intensive care high dependency unit and return to a normal medical ward. As I gradually improved, the figures interfered less. They stayed within the picture until I was alone, and only then would they come out to bother me. And eventually they spent longer and longer within the frame of the picture, but would still occasionally wink at me, wave a hand or smile or make some snide comment, until eventually they stayed exactly where they were. And I returned with increasing horror to full normal consciousness. It was only when these hallucinations ceased that I appreciated the gravity of my situation and the magnitude of the uphill task I would have to recover. I was very weak and had multiple cranial nerve deficits, most of which recovered, but some of which have persisted. And it took me about 6 months to get anything like normal function again. What kept me going during this pretty dreadful period was the determination to live life to the full and achieve my potential, having been given a second chance to live. It gave me the resolution, optimism, and determination to keep going during a very, very difficult period. And I did improve and eventually managed to scrape through my medical degree and qualify as a doctor after many tribulations. Having come back from the brink, I had a lust for life and was grateful to be alive. Throughout the rest of my life, I have tried my best to live up to this and to maximize my opportunities and live as fully as possible. I hope that I've managed to do this and will continue to do for the rest of the time available to me. Well, I think that's all I can honestly and realistically say about events that happened so long ago. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Stories of Hope, brought to you by the Curing Coma campaign. For more information about the Curing Coma campaign and additional resources, please visit curingcoma.org. Don't forget to subscribe and be notified whenever a new episode is released.